and a noted authority on religion and social issues in Southeast Asia. She is currently visiting professorial fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities, Singapore University of Technology and Design. I will now hand over to Dr. Siddiqui to introduce the speakers for this panel. Dr. Siddiqui.
Thank you, Lynn, and I'm here to kick off the first panel discussion on unity. I would like this morning to make my comment very brief, and to kick off this session, I'd like to just share with you a short quote from a recent article by Edward Glaser and Abhad Joshi Ghani titled "Rethinking Cities Towards Shared Prosperity." And this is the quote. Perhaps the most hopeful aspect of urban life is that cities tend to create their own solutions. There is hope in the future of cities because cities have so often done miraculous things, unquote. Perhaps this is a useful frame of reference for our reflections on the topic of the first session, From Differences, Unity. Singapore has certainly tended to create and continues to create its own solutions, and many of these have certainly been little short of miraculous. We are privileged this morning to be able to listen to two of Singapore's most eminent thinkers on this subject. They are NTU professor and sociologist, Associate Professor Kwok Hian Woon, and GIC Chief Economist Dr. Leslie Teo. Both of them will be speaking, of course, in their personal capacities. So without further delay, I would like to invite Kian Woon to make his presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. And I guess when Janata say that we are the poor people here, it's because we have to sit through a lot of statistics and digest them instantaneously. So I think I will try and do something different and engage in perhaps a more qualitative kind of reasoning together with all of us about the theme of differences, which, as you can see from the survey just reported, we tend to think in terms of differences along the lines of our multiracialism and its associated multis, multilingualism, multi-religiosity, more generally, multiculturalism, all pivoting around a basic idea of race and races, abbreviated as CMIO, Chinese, Malay, Indian, other. The last being a residual category encapsulating all others other than CMI, and especially Eurasians and others. I don't know how to pronounce CMIO, but sometimes we hear the term CIMO, which I suppose is pronounced as Chimo. And most recently, I've seen the term used as a verb, as in Ivan Heng mentioning on Facebook. I would hate to see another version of National Day Parade where we chimo. More of this later. But first, since I've mentioned National Day, Let's go a little back, and this is Liu Kang's famous work, National Day, painted in 1967. And for those of you who want to see the real painting in front of you, the exhibition at the National Museum runs till 16th of March. So I've done my advertisement for NHB today. All right? Just look at the colors, the vibrant colors, the idea of a new nation almost starting on a fresh page. The aspirations and the sentiments, this fullness of life, and also notice the little children that are around. The new nation does not exist for a present generation, but also for future generations. Liu Kang, of course, had ideas about art, and one of his ideas was that art transcends national boundaries. It's the highest achievement to represent the common sentiment of all humanity. And that humanity, that sentiment, can find expression within national boundaries. So, when we began as an independent nation state, the cultural and artistic activities, the ministries dealing with culture and arts and so on, quite naturally were in the direction of reflecting the realities and the aspirations of the society. But also with an idea that quite possibly in something we call art, it can transcend even language boundaries and by extension, racial and religious divides. And this really began before 1965. Even a decade before independence. The founding principle of the Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts was looking ahead to a future form of art, which has been called Nanyang art. And the word Nanyang, the South Seas, doesn't quite just refer enormously to Southeast Asia, but to multiracial Malaya, which was at that time shackled, I quote, by the colonial ruler in his effort to move into the modern times. And this moment in our history of decolonization, even anti-colonialism, right? And this sense of belonging to a larger and diverse whole, it's something that we have quite forgotten if we think that our history of the nation began exactly in 1965. And notice this future orientation in 1955, and perhaps even earlier, in terms which we are still grappling with: good government, free from racial prejudice, enjoy mass culture and education, freedom and artistic expression for all races. I think we cannot imagine the kind of things we're doing today without these very early and perhaps even earlier kinds of aspirations. Not just the beginning of the nation, but something like a pre-nation in the making of the nation. And what do we see in that era? This is a famous painting by Chua Mya-Thi. It's also in the same exhibition. It looks better if you are right in front of it, just a few feet away. National Language Class. Now, today I won't pretend to be an art commentator or critic, but you might guess that the words that on the blackboard and the cikgu in front of the board, the words were, and it sounds like Bahasa Melayu 101. And the words are, siapa nama kamu? Di mana awak tinggal? What is your name? Where do you live? Mr. Chua is in his early 80s today. I was very keen because when I was looking at the picture, something struck me. If you look at this young man here, and by the way, Chua Mya-ki was in the crowd, in the group, and he was painting his friends as part of the group. On his sleeve, you might notice something. And I first thought it was what in Chinese we call a mourning cloth. Right? It used to be customary, less so today, where if any one of our loved ones died, we will express this on our sleeve with a piece of cloth, square, maybe a white background, and maybe something like a sackcloth on it. And I was so intrigued by this. An artist doesn't put in little details accidentally, incidentally. So in any case, I got a friend to call Mr. Chua last night as part of last-minute preparation. And yes, he confirmed. There's a reason why it's there. I can expand on the reason, which is more than just the fact that even as one is in mourning, one makes sure that one attends the national language class. But more than that, the passing of a generation, the moving into modern times, indeed, not just entering a new era, but creating a new era while wearing one's customs literally on one's sleeve. Okay? So much for scholarly over-interpretation. But let's stay on a moment. You know, in the 1980s, an American sociologist in Harvard had a book because of the changing of the American curriculum from the canon into something much more diverse. Nathan Glaser said, "We are all multiculturalists now." Excuse me, we in Singapore have been multiculturalists for the longest time, and perhaps also interculturalists. And much of it was associated with an earlier time where there is a sense of common struggle. And it's interesting that this whole theme of differences today, whether it's religion, race, or language, is now embedded within a larger narrative about differences in terms of social class, in terms of economic difference. Right? Now, I won't go too much into this, and now I will take you 50 years or 60 years from this time. And there we have it. The National Day, sorry, not National Day, the New Year's Day countdown on the eve of New Year, just this past December, end of December, right? Now, I would like to say something. Ivan is a good friend of mine. This is not about Ivan. It's about the larger phenomenon of CMIO, multiracialism, in our midst, played out on different occasions, the sorts of things that come out from such episodes, and now distributed, circulated, extended, expanded, all over on the internet and online. These are part of a phenomenon related to CMIO, multiracialism. And this is where Ivan says, as much as I would hate to see another NDP where we chimo, right? But where were the Malays, Indians, Eurasians, Peranakans, not to mention blah, 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 right? So in other words, this kind of discourse is a kind of mirror image of official multiracialism along representative, proportional, formulaic, functional lines. And the question I pose today is, can we think out of the CMIO box and the boxes within CMIO. Can we imagine another kind of multiculturalism? We might not even be aware of the terms we are using. I got this from a very authoritative source called the Oxford English Dictionary. Mind you, it's Oxford, not Oxford. Yeah. But surely, we might even have forgotten how certain terms were used by groups and across groups and so on. How does this play out? Just let me go a little longer. So it goes on. So this comes from a post, Dear the Real Singapore, I am a Malay and I felt left out at the New Year Countdown 2014. And so on it goes. But something else is happening in our society. In our Singapore conversation last year, which is reported in a very nice booklet, when there is a page that has a reference to regardless of race, language, and religion, I look hard to look at traces of race, language, and of religion. No, on this page, it talks about respecting every individual, regardless of the job he does, qualification he holds, or his position in society. And then there's talk about the elderly and the treatment of every child, and so on and so forth. So, in some ways, we are leading, I wouldn't say a schizophrenic existence, but think about the kind of reformulation of meritocracy that is going on. Open, compassionate, which kind of makes one wonder, what was the earlier form of meritocracy? Not so open, and certainly lacking in compassion. And if that kind of democracy, meritocracy, which has been a pillar of Singapore's ideological framework, is being reformulated, what about multiracialism? Now, I can go on, but I think in the interest of time, let me just say that there is an interesting dynamic between multiracialism and meritocracy. Multiracialism provides an organic view of the world in which one must be a member of one community. Meritocracy provides an atomistic view of the world in which one is an atom, a sole individual competing with other individuals. We have not quite figured out how different aspects of our selves have been forged, formulated. You might recognize that young man on the left, Janadas, who wrote this a few years ago, and he was referring, of course, to the National Pledge. And Janadas was highlighting not just the fact that in the early days of the nation state, our leaders had to think about, excuse me, what are we going to do about the flag-raising ceremony? We need something to accompany that. And so Mr. Ong Pang Boon was tasked with this. He had a draft, which Mr. Rajaratnam commented on. And Mr. Rajaratnam had this early draft, which we learned from sources, including Janadas repeating this, that Minister Mentor Lee said in Parliament recently, this was in 2009, that he had trimmed out the unachievable in Mr. Rajaratnam's draft. The unachievable trimmed out. And Janadas, in this nice article, is saying, look, realistically, we cannot forget differences. We must remember in order to forget, right? Of course, we use words very cleverly. Now, I am wanting to say a little more about this. Multiracialism, multiculturalism of this kind is more demanding than everything else that we have experienced. We don't realize just how radical it is to be engaged in this form of multiracialism and to think out of the CMIO box and its sub-boxes, to reach higher and to go deeper. And the conventional idea of tolerance, understanding, and respect going together from one to the other may not necessarily be so. Tolerance may not lead to more understanding. Understanding may not lead to more respect. It requires us, even in the midst of understanding and misunderstanding, to accept what we cannot understand and cannot accept of the other. And here I'm moving to the last part of my presentation. This comes from the Health Sciences Authority about blood donation. As you all know, the body is the site where one, as a member of a larger social body, not the nation, but one's closest community, protects one's space. And also, there are all kinds of what might be anthropologically called taboos to maintain and define those boundaries. And as we just heard, ethnicity as compared to race, a geneticized, essentialized idea of somehow culture is passed down through genes and in your blood. Ethnicity requires a choice of what one emphasizes in drawing and maintaining boundaries, how one would like not to be contaminated or polluted by this messy, diverse, modern world out there. I was quite amazed that in Singapore, the figures for blood donation, something like nearly 2% of blood donors are ensuring that Singapore is safe. When blood is needed, blood will be there. And I'm quite sure both the donors and the recipients cut across all races. And if one wants a clarification from the Mufti of Singapore, Islam has arrived on a consensus, even though transfusion and bone marrow transplantation are recent medical developments which did not exist during the time of early Muslim jurists. The consensus is that it is permissible. And there's an interesting condition. The transplant procedure must not contain elements of sale and purchase. And there's a whole literature on blood donation as a voluntary act compared to paid blood as a source for blood in any nation. And this comes from the idea that, and I just need 1 minute more to offer this very profound insight. This comes from the idea that when we donate and receive blood, we are giving and receiving from strangers with no names. As Richard Titmuss in his famous book says, there is a bond that links men and women in the world so closely and intimately that every difference of color and religious belief and cultural heritage is insignificant beside it. The life stream of blood that runs in the veins of every member of the human race proves that the family of man is a reality. I might also quickly add, in a place where the Chinese are the minority or were the minority, in a neighboring country called Indonesia, one of its greatest writers, Pramodia Ananta Toa, when he was speaking up for the Chinese as a minority, he had this to say. He asked, why am I so concerned with the whole question of the Chinese in Indonesia? 3 reasons. First, because my feeling of humanism is offended. Second, because I prefer being friends with the people of all countries. And third, because I could not deny if it was said that it is possible that I also have Chinese blood flowing in me. So, who are our strangers? And what's this about trimming out all the unachievable when in some ways it is being achieved anonymously without us quite thinking about it? And as Max Weber would say, politics as the art of the possible begins from thinking about the impossible. And Singapore has been a story about the unachievable and the impossible. Who is the stranger? Who is my stranger? Who are our strangers? We all face the universal stranger. And he or she, they are. He or she is, they are. All of us in our dependent relations on each other, all of us in our interdependent relations with each other, and the stranger is ourselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kian Woon. Can I please now ask Leslie to make his presentation? That was great.
Good morning. Good morning. I will ask for forgiveness. I'm the only economist today. So unfortunately, I will talk about dollars and cents. And when I talk about differences, I'm going to be talking about the distribution of income and wealth. I'm also going to be stereotypical because what I'm going to say will sound dismal. However, and I guess in contrast to, but I hope you see that the contrast does lead somewhere, to Kian Woon's inspirational challenge for us to transcend differences, my message is one where, yes, it's a dismal possibility, but we can, as Kian Woon said, we can always do what is not predictable. So let me tell you a bit about what I'm going to try to do today. First, to set the context for my remarks, I will talk about globalization and technological change. I know it's maybe boring, accepted, and so on, but I just want to remind ourselves of the biggest strategic decision, in a way, if it's a decision that Singapore made, which is to be open. Right? This openness enabled Singapore to converge with the developed, called developed countries or high-income countries, in a very short time. This convergence is not a given, was not a given. So it took a decision and many decisions to ensure that it happened. At the same time, however, globalization and technological change have led to growth, and I will show some data on this, in differences in our incomes within Singapore. They have done so in ways that, if you are a standard economist, you would feel completely comfortable with, because they result from the right, I guess, reward for the right effort. Right? We upgraded our skills, so people got better pay, and so on. But they are also caused by some trends, causes that we might, as a society, call unhealthy or ill. Things like entrenchment effects or winner-takes-all effects. So this difference or growing differential in income inequality and in wealth has about the fairness that Singapore have of their society. Next, I will posit that these trends, since we are open to the world, will not diminish. In fact, I think they will get worse, at least for a time. So, and let me reiterate again what these trends do, right? So it's a very complex set of effects. It's probably positive in some sense overall, but more positive for the haves, and not so positive for the don't haves, and increasingly the middle class, and those who are unprepared for globalization and technological change. I conclude by sharing a few thoughts on what might be done, focusing on the labor market, which is this econ speak for people. The upshot of my argument is that we will not only need an educated, skilled labor force, but one that is probably more resilient, more adaptable, and has much heart as it has head. So let me start by talking just a little bit about convergence, just to remind ourselves, right? So globalization, what do we mean? It's the free exchange of goods, services, and ideas. I emphasize ideas, probably the most important thing for the case of Singapore in some sense, right? As a small open economy, early on, we were open to the global marketplace. We attracted foreign capital. We upgraded the workforce, put in place efficient infrastructure, business-friendly environment. You had the conditions for sustained economic growth. So this chart just shows one aspect of that, the human aspect, which is that in one generation, Singapore's human capital converged to that of the high-income countries, right? Singapore is the red line. Consequently, conventional measures of economic well-being, like per capita, emphasize per capita, GDP, also converge, and because of measurement effects, maybe exchange rate, exceeds that of the high-income countries today. Again, the red line. This is also true if you try to account for the large presence of non-citizens in our economy. So you use a concept like GNP or GNI per capita. Red line, again, we have converged. So in sum, that openness enabled us to quickly catch up to the high-income countries. What about divergence? Those very forces of globalization and technological change, right, likely made the distribution income in Singapore more dispersed, wider. We are familiar with the Gini coefficients. Let me show you chart 5, divergence. Here's an interesting data set from Atkinson and Piketty looking at income tax data for Singapore, right? And over the last 30 years, right, you see the blue line and the red lines. The blue line is the bottom 90%, the average of the bottom 90% of income earners in Singapore. The blue line is the top 10%. So all, back to this chart, over the last 30 or so years, this chart shows growth in real incomes across different countries. You do see the nice red bars, Singapore again, increasing. But you see another phenomena, which is that the rate of increase has not been equal across different deciles of income. Indeed, if you look closer at the data, within the top 10%, the increase has been greatest at the highest 0.1%. So I know we're all referring to the poor people. Unfortunately, most of us are in the poor category if you look in this kind of analysis or data. Right? 99%, we all have experienced increased real incomes, but the greatest increase has been at the highest level. This chart same data, maybe a bit more easy to understand, right? If you think of, you know, from 1963 to 2000, the real income, again real, of the average of the 90 percentile, bottom 90% household, right, has gone up from 17K to 50,000, approximately 55,000. The top has gone from 174,000 to 925,000, the top 1%, 0.1%. Looked at it differently, this is the curve of for the last 2 decades. By, again, the bottom 90%, the top, the top 10%, 5%, 1%. And you see the red line, Singapore, the increase of those who are in the top categories, consistent with what we see, you know, Jana referred to this in the US. But it's actually not just a US phenomenon. We see this phenomenon in many developed countries, including the Scandinavian countries, although, of course, there the level of inequality is lower, from a starting lower level. So what do I conclude from this? Well, actually, maybe I should just emphasize this fact a little bit more. If you look at household income decile, this is shorter term data, right, last decade, and you look at the increase across the different deciles. Again, this is corroborated by household survey, Atkins and Piketty's from income tax data. You see that increase of the top side. You see, it's a bit hard to see, but you could see lower increase. You could categorize it as stagnation of the broad middle. And then, of course, you see the decline in the real wages for those in the lowest decile. Not unfamiliar to us. So let me just kind of repeat, right, my conclusions looking at this data. First, over the long term, incomes of all groups have risen. Second, this effect is greatest for those who are at the highest income levels. Third, more recently, right, those in the highest income have seen an acceleration in their increase. Those in the middle and lower have seen a stagnation or a decline, very low, kind of near zero, or in the last decile, definitely a decline. Now, does this bother you? Even though I'm an economist, it does bother me. But we have to think carefully about where we go next, right? Because changes in income distribution are not necessarily by themselves, changes, this may not be a bad phenomena. For example, I could have shown you this as an example of a person who is just born and growing over time and finally retiring, right? So the key here is mobility. If mobility remains high, then actually this, well, especially if you're an economist, it's not so much of a problem. Also, I would note there are undoubtedly domestic factors that have affected what is happening in Singapore, in particular immigration, but this is a global trend, so Singapore is in some ways not unique. So I come back to globalization and technological change with the emphasis on technological change. Right? This is probably the major driver. I mean, of course, there are other causes, but the major driver. So let me explore these forces in a bit more greater detail. First, there's the standard effect, the globalization effect. You know, we say, well, we were open to trade and capital. This enabled us to upgrade our workforce because MNCs would set up a plant here, use our lower skilled labor, and they upgraded themselves over time. You know, you get this should lower inequality, and indeed, that's what the data shows. Today, I'm sad to report, it's something we want, but income country that benefited, you know, that saw job losses before, right? So today, globalization is probably, in some sense, negative for the income distribution. What about technology? Right. Those with skills, right, are going to benefit from this world that we live in. I think this is not unfamiliar to us. We can call this the premium that accrues to people who have skills that are in relatively higher demand. First of all, they have the skills. Second, because they're relatively scarce, they can bargain for higher wages. One explanation. I think it's largely true, right? But there are a few other observations I want to make. Given the importance of education, given the distribution of education across our population, right, there are big winners and big losers. In particular, the pioneer generation, not so educated. And therefore, in this kind of world, it's not friendly to them and their incomes. Two, we may be close to the point. I think The Economist and Tyler Cohen has a book on this, but The Economist had a lead article on this 2 weeks ago. We may be at the point where the IT revolution really dramatically changes the way we use, labor, robotics, and so on. So the fear here is that computers and robots are going to replace not just low-skilled labor, semi-skilled labor, and some high-skilled labor, right? So this work by Fry and Osborne, where they try to calculate the probability of a job being computerized, right? They estimate 47% of jobs can be easily or are likely to be computerized, as this chart shows. Economists, by the way, don't do too well. We're in the middle. Many jobs that you think, things like taxi drivers, in sales, do we need retail broker? Do we need real estate brokers, insurance agents? All these jobs may or may not, at least they're at risk. And third, in a world where technology is the key driver, there's a phenomenon called the rate of increasing returns is a bit harder to see diminish, going away. So there are winner-takes-all type effects, there are entrenchment effects, right? For example, it appears, this is data that shows that Singapore households who are in the higher income deciles, right, spend more, both in relative and absolute terms, on their kids' private education. Assuming there is some benefit to this, assuming there's a benefit, it makes their kids more likely to succeed, right? And again, this changes people's perception of fairness. Finally, the importance of finance. One, it is a force of convergence. It's also a force of divergence. One is very simple. In finance, people seem to earn higher incomes, right? Insofar as our economy, let's say you compare it with the US and the UK, has a higher proportion of value added from finance, right? This could be one reason why the income distribution is skewed the way it is. Right? I was looking at some data, for example, by a guy called Kaplan at the University of Chicago, where he was looking at the highest paid. This phenomena of the top 1% is actually across many industries, but he compared someone in a hedge fund and a lawyer in a, this is US data. Lawyer earns, maybe 1 time or 2 times what the top 1% is, the top lawyer. The hedge fund manager earns 200 times, right? 500 million, nearly $500 million, versus a lawyer of, 5 million. So think of, this is the finance effect, if you like. Another phenomenon with finance is that the richer you are, the more likely that you are able to have access to borrowing, if you want, but certainly to investments in real estate and in financial markets. And insofar as these are good things over the long time, they give you a leg up, right? So I've told you what the phenomena is. Maybe there is some agreement on not so much agreement. Actually, there's a lot of controversy in the subjects among economists, but that's not telling you anything since economists can't agree on most things. What do we do? Okay. First, as a caveat, I take as given that we don't believe in equality for everything, right? But we also believe that a society where a sizable majority do not benefit from broader progress is not sustainable, let alone just. I also note that others have discussed different sorts of other policies, fiscal policy, taxation, reforms of education, labor, immigration. These are all possible solutions. What I want to focus on is a little bit more, again, as I said, human, personal. It's about the people. And it centers on education, something we are good at. So again, maybe this sounds boring, but 3 thoughts, right? First, emphasize again the creative application of knowledge and the social intelligence to sell it, right? It's not about regurgitating facts. It's no longer about just collecting data. Computers are going to do that, right? All of us are going to face this challenge. Second, there's increasing evidence that skills learned in early childhood have long-term and significant effects. So this is one area where I think maybe there are a lot of gains. And of course, if we do invest in early childhood education, it does help with the equal opportunity issue. So this is the work, I'm an economist, he's not the only one, but James Heckman has something called his Heckman equation. Third, we probably need to rethink how we learn. Right? In a world of technological change, all of us will have to retool and readapt. But our formal systems are not adapted to this. Yeah? You pass university or out of school, and that's it. Yeah, you might in your own initiative, but hey, that's a 19th century kind of system. We haven't quite figured out how to do. And it's really important because if I just said the aging labor force, right? 2 issues there. One is that you have this distribution of educational attainment. Those who are not equipped are going to suffer disproportionately. Second, we're all going to live older. Is 65 the retirement age for the future? Probably not, right? 70, 80? But to do that, you need to retool and learn. Finally, given the unpredictable nature of technological change, as a society, we have to figure out how to help those who get off the track, those who suffer, so that we can keep on getting on, changing careers and so on. In the US, in the developed world, actually there's a lot of concern about what's called hysteresis, long-term unemployment. If you are unemployed, for example, in the US for more than 26 weeks, the probability of you being getting employed after that declines significantly. So this world where we will see changes of tectonic, we have to figure out how to make sure that people get back on the train very quickly. So to conclude, technology and globalization have benefited us. It's actually, let's not forget how it's benefited us. But technology and globalization are painful, powerful, unfair forces. It's not going to get better. It's going to get worse, in my view, in the sense of the intensity of this. So the fundamental challenge actually lies with us trying to respond to this. Government is an enabler. It should help infrastructure and so on. But it's about the individual level. It's about melding old values, right, that have helped us, like hard work, reliability, drive to succeed, with new fuzzier things like creativity, curiosity, imagination. willingness to question the status quo, willingness to challenge. In short, it's actually a change in mindset. And so I think that's the challenge. It's my, I guess, coming back, yeah, there are differences. These differences are going to get, especially in the economic sphere, more problematic. But if we have the right mindset individually, we can take advantage, actually. That's the Singapore story, right? Taking advantage of globalization and technological change. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leslie, for that thought-provoking presentation. I think both speakers have certainly validated my initial comment that Singapore tends to find its own solutions and that many of them are nothing short of miraculous. So on that note, and given the presentations, I'm not sure whether I should start with the left and go to the right, or whether I should go to the right and start with the right and go to the left. So perhaps I'll open this just by asking someone in the center to ask the first question if they're so inclined. And also please state your name, make your question brief so that we can accommodate as many differences of opinion as possible. Thank you very much. Who's going to give us the first question? Yeah, at the back? No? Yeah, okay. Yes, please. Have we got a question there?
Goodness, shouldn't be so hard.
Is someone else, maybe?
Yeah, we got it.
Yeah, it's working.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I am Paul Tambaya from the National University of Singapore Medical School. I'm also with Marua, a civil society organization. I understand the questions are directed at the panel, not at the first presenter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry.
Yeah, but I'd be interested to know what Dr. Kwok or Professor Kwok feels in relation to the first speaker's presentation, because there was this question about the state and the CMIO and the idea of regardless of race, language, or religion. The first speaker didn't provide any p-values, but the most striking graph I thought in the entire presentation was the fact that there were no Malay PRs at all in his graph. He had Chinese PRs versus Chinese Singaporeans, Indian PRs versus Indian Singaporeans, Malay Singaporeans, but no Malay PRs. So it suggests that the state has chosen to handle its immigration policy to the exclusion of one particular race. So how does that fit in with the framework that he dealt with?
You want to take that question?
Thank you for your question, and I won't answer on behalf of the state. But clearly, this is yet another example of proportional, functional, formulaic kind of multiracialism, such that even immigration policies are honed towards some kind of quantitative distribution. That's true, perhaps for very good reasons. The kind of logic underlying the GRCs, and so on and so forth. So this is a kind of a repeated dominant motif of the Singapore story. And I guess what we are trying to say is, can we, at this stage, 50, 60 years later, do a little more? I think very much in the spirit of what Janadas said towards the end of his comments. If we believe that there is this something more, something beyond, and something deeper, something higher, and the choice is ours. So I don't pretend to offer yet another formula, but to say that there is room for greater discretion, greater latitude of thinking about a whole host of issues. The very fact that the IPS survey was along these lines of CMIO, and how can we imagine another kind of understanding of our population and our immigrants beyond that? So again, I think as a good scholar, I raise questions rather than answer them.
Thank you, Kenwood. Another question, please, from anywhere? Yeah. Yeah, over here, please. Yeah.
Sharon, this is Don Hughes. I'm a retired banker. I'm from the United States, and I'm very familiar with the discussions in America about income gap, and all of the background and context that comes with that discussion in the United States. What I'd like to ask Leslie and maybe the other panel members to comment on, you talked about the rising incomes of the upper deciles here in Singapore, and to some extent that's related to economic development and growth. What I wanted to learn more about is how Singapore is not like the United States, in the sense of the continued. To me, the key of an economy is the ability of anybody who's born into the economy to reach their level of, whatever level of performance, whatever level of income, whatever level of lifestyle they want to have. So it's about access. And I think in Singapore, we see so much emphasis on maintaining access to education, maybe now even more access to early pre-K education, access to health, affordability of housing, affordability of all of the things that matter to our basic cost of living. So one of the things that we used to see in the United States, where they would measure what was the movement between deciles in any given 10-year period, how many people went from the bottom 20 to the top 20, how many people went from the middle 30 down or up. And I wonder if that kind of information is available in Singapore, because to me, there's much more vibrancy here than in the United States, and there's much more opportunity for movement between these deciles. And it seems to me that there ought to be more optimism in the middle classes in Singapore than we're seeing right now in the United States. So maybe just some thoughts on that.
Maybe,
I
maybe three thoughts grouped along three lines. I guess if I'm thinking of more specific domestic factors that might affect the results, one is clearly immigration. There has been, at least in recent times, significantly greater than the proportions in the U.S. Second is, I think the general level of education in Singapore probably differs from the general level of education in the U.S. In the sense of, it's probably on a national point of view much more uniform and consistent and perhaps higher, whereas in the US, live in the wrong district and your public school is going to be quite crappy. So those two things I think are big, probably accentuate or might affect the results. Second thought, I guess you asked, what about access? I think, that finance story and that real estate story is probably bigger of an effect in Singapore, just because we're a city-state. U.S. is a big country, and during boom times, and given people's level of home ownership and stuff, it probably affects wealth and income to a greater proportion and extent than the U.S. I guess my third thought has to do with. So those are differences. Actually, I focus again back on the sort of similarities, because my main point in Singapore, those of us who have, have converged to the global in the country, right? The best Singaporeans probably are, able to work with, talk with. They are related to the global economy at the best level of the global economy. But in Singapore, we also have that part of the society, which is consistent with what's happening in Myanmar or Bangladesh or Cambodia within a city-state. So we have this two bifurcated. Now, on your point about mobility, I actually tried to look for information. So maybe there's other work that people here are familiar with, but there are some classic work by Ng, I think, that shows that the level of social mobility in Singapore is consistent with that of the US, so a ratio of 0.4. But more recent work by Chun Seng, who, looking at better data, had slightly higher mobility. One of the problems is there's not a lot of history, right? So there's not a lot of cohort. So Chun Seng's data focused on the 1970s cohort. So it's not inconceivable that in that cohort, given the huge increase in Singapore moving from a developing to a developed country, you had a lot of social mobility. I mean, my dad didn't go to university, didn't even finish high school. So those kind of jumps are possible for the first generation. Now we don't know because we are now living in the later cohorts. We have to wait to see what happens.
Did you have anything? No? Another question, maybe from some, yes? Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you.
Yes.
I have a question for Ken Woon. Oh, I'm Chan Hing Chi, and I'm at the Lee Kuan Yew Center for Innovative Cities at the new university, Singapore University of Technology and Design. The question is on ethnicity, the way we view identity, and the topic is differences, and out of differences, unity. Now, Ken Woon, I like your sentiment and share your sentiment that you hope one day we'll all be unified and we can leave aside our ethnic identities and differences. But can you conceive of the two coexisting at the same time and in harmony, that you can feel your differences, but you also share a common identity? You know, the unity comes from that. That is, you are Malay, Chinese, Indians, but others, but also you feel very Singaporean, which is a supra-ethnic identity which is being developed out of shared experiences, education, food, Singlish, etc. So it's not either or, you know. And you hope one day the Singaporean side, the shared identity is there, but it's not wrong to feel that you are Muslim, you are Hindu, Indian, just like Americans are Italian Americans, French Americans, Arab Americans. Now, Arab Americans today feel a bit under some threat. And so my point is, you know, the coexistence.
Sure.
The second point I want to ask is a question. You didn't bring in global developments, external developments, and their impact on the identities and the differences. For instance, when I was teaching the course on ethnic politics as a political scientist in the university in the 80s, I went around asking my class how they identified themselves. And this was in the late 80s. Well, the Chinese said, I'm Chinese, I'm Hokkien, or whatever. And one Malay student told me that he doesn't feel Malay. He identifies himself as Muslim. And I think it was in reaction post the Iranian Revolution, the Ummah, and everyone was feeling more as a, I think Muslims were beginning to feel they were a global community. So external developments can impact on your identity, you know, and although you can have a unified Singaporean, some development outside can make a particular, whether it's ethnicity or race, feel more of that particular quality. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed, Professor Chan. in some ways you have eloquently articulated an ideal which is which overlaps with much of what I'm saying. Perhaps more than just the coexistence of different kinds of identities, different levels of identities, overlapping, multiple, hybrid, you know, this is already happening on a daily basis. I guess what I'm saying is that not everything needs to and is racialized at any one time. And to that extent, having race in our heads, well, perhaps not all the time, it's not necessarily a development that can bring about more possibilities. And of course, I work with you as the chair of the National Arts Council, and I made some references to the arts. And this is one area. The arts doesn't need to be racial or racialized. The old formula of the variety show where you have Chinese, Malay, and Indian, and which now exists in some kind of New Year countdown, and then people start to argue, you know, it's so China, and you know, this so and so spoke to me in Chinese, or and so on and so forth. That's where I'm getting at. And also we can't imagine that. I don't think I'm a Pollyanna or a utopia. The road to utopia is paved with not only good intentions, but also many strange unintended consequences, including violence and so on. But with the way that we do things in Singapore, I think it's within our realm of possibility to imagine how to transform, not that kind of functional multiracialism, but maybe a transformative kind of multiculturalism. I know this sounds like very grand and so on. Now, for the global, yes, definitely, it's on my mind, and I was sort of half expecting a question along these lines. Everything can be up for grabs today, whether it's, and I've got a whole list of at least 10, whether it's doctrine in terms of theology, family, peer group influence, gender, personal identity, employment, age, education, and law, ethics, and so on, media, the internet. If you talk about identities, we are now having younger generations in which the identities are instantaneously formed moment to moment, depending on which website you click onto, or which Facebook account you access, and so on. So yes, I think what Janadas who said that there's a changed world, but it's always been a changed world for Singapore. And Singapore is a child of globalization from day one. So we live with this. Yeah.
Thank you. Leslie, did you? No? Yeah. Another question? Yeah. Please. Yeah. Right. Yes. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Gillian from IPS. Much has been said already, though we're only at 10:40 this morning. So I just want to draw various things together and pose to Professor Kwok a pointed question. I think in the survey you saw that the identification with Singapore was much stronger than it was with race and religion. So my question is, how do we reinforce this overarching identity? Though I've heard what you said to Prof. Chan and all that. What specifically, and don't answer this question with a question, would you like that we can reinforce this overarching identity? Is it something organic, something you teach or you catch? Or do you have something specific in mind in terms of removing certain structures, policies, or institutions that you want done? Last year, there was a debate about removing the GRC system that was forwarded by Marwa, which I argued against for various reasons, primarily based on this survey. So what is it, organic, or is it that there should be changes to legislation and policy? To Mr. Teo, and I heard what you said about your dad and yourself, really, we've come through a process where we started where everybody was equally poor. And we've gone through development, and of course now there are differences. So hearing what you said, are we concerned about looking at social mobility for everyone? I mean, people like me, like you, will study the figures. Or should we really be focused on social mobility for this generation's 20%, and looking at how over the 10 years, 20 years from now, they do better, and then so on and so forth. This is really important because if you want the first, you would argue that we should move towards more universal, more universalistic social support systems as opposed to a more targeted assistant-based one where we look at addressing the second formulation, which is to say, what do we do about the poor and disadvantaged families today? And I'll leave you to decide, is it the bottom 20 or the bottom 30%? And I heard you about the disappearing middle class, average is over. So please try and throw that into the mix as well. I mean, you're welcome to. Thank you.
While you two are busy thinking about how to answer Gillian, maybe I'll take one more question, and then we'll give the floor back to the presenters to wrap up, because I think we're running out of time. And maybe I can call on Anne to have the final word in terms of a question.
I'm Anne Wee from NUS. I recall in the 1950s, when I was around, that low-skilled workers were Division 4 staff, and they had membership of the Amalgamated Union of Public Employees, they had medical leave, they had holiday leave, they were part of the staff. I would like Dr. Teo to comment on the outsourcing system by which these jobs are now done by contract labor, and because this is economic, obviously their wages go down because the contractor has to make his fair share, and because they're contract labor, it's much more dicey for them to get into, get the rights under the Employment Act, because he can, you know, not keep them long enough to qualify and so on. And then we've been worked against our will into what I think is actually a poisonous system called workfare. Now, you may be surprised I think it's poisonous. It does two things. It subsidizes the employer, which is not exactly a Singapore thing, and it pauperizes your low-skilled because they get used to handouts, which is very unhealthy. Perhaps Dr. Teo could give us some comments.
Thank you. Well, we have run out of time, so I will give what no time we have left to a wrap-up on the side of Kian Woon first, and then Leslie. Please, Kian Woon.
Leslie, you sure you don't want to go first? Okay. Okay. So, Gillian, I won't answer your pointed question with another pointed question. So, the easiest shortcut to have national identity and Singaporean identity is to find a few more enemies. And every time when somebody says something nasty about us, it's a great moment to show our nationalism. If we can engineer that all the time, as I think was periodically done for each other between Singapore and Malaysia. So really, there are no shortcuts. And you also can imagine that part of the dynamics of relating to new immigrants, potential immigrants, and foreigners has led to greater feeling of being Singaporean. And is that something that we want? A Singaporeanness that is based on so-called xenophobia. Yeah. You know, just now I quoted Pramodia, and he spoke about humanism. And for a so-called young country with so-called young intellectual traditions, the sense that we really need to develop many aspects of our collective life and our individual search and so on. This, I know this is not a satisfactory answer, but something is happening if we were to believe, and I do believe, everything that Leslie is telling us. In some ways, we have a lot to fear about each other. It's not differences that we should fear. It's similarities, sameness in ambition. I read somewhere, what happens when we share the same desire, the same desires in an environment of scarce resources? So the answer, it doesn't come from the sphere of culture and the arts and so on, the soft side. It also comes from a very strong commitment precisely to those values in the pledge: equality, justice, and not just charity and philanthropy, and something called kindness. Kindness must be of the sort that behind the kindness, there's every potential for hatred. And the fact that so much is sort of underground in a way, and there's so much concern, regardless of race, language, and religion, has become regardful, sensitivity towards, in a way that we can't talk about it because there is this fear. Even as I stand here, I had this fear that certain questions might be asked, which I may not know how to answer. I don't feel I have the authority. Yeah. So it's going to take a lot more, and both the cultural side of things and the economic infrastructure side of things will have to go hand in hand. I know you're not satisfied with the answer.
Leslie?
Okay. Maybe I venture to take a few risks. One is to add to Kian Wen's answer. I guess aside from an enemy, in my view, just to remind ourselves again, I think how people feel about the opportunities they have, and unfortunately, economic reward is a big part of it. Shouldn't be maybe, but it is. How they feel about the fairness of the system will probably be very important for them in their identity as Singapore, right? So merit has a very meritocracy, for example, for a certain group of people, very important, right? That's something we know as Singaporeans. So anyway, that's to answer both Gillian and Anne's question. It goes into the realm, a little bit into the realm of political, I think, philosophy, policy making. Very hard to be so specific. I think it really, but I also don't want to not answer your question, okay? So I give you my opinion. I think, Gillian, to your question, there are two phenomena that are happening, and we have focused quite a bit on the bottom side, in my view, in the last few years. But if I were thinking about this from, trying to have a conversation with society and public policy, I would ask a question: what are we after when we are talking about the top, and what are we after when we're talking about the middle and the bottom? And what do I mean here? We could be, and in my presentation, I simplified things. I said solution has to do with the people education. Actually, I believe that strongly. It's the individual taking advantage, best equipped, best able to take advantage of the vagaries of our difficult work. But then as a society, we want to get together and we want to say, okay, not everybody is going to be equally up to this task, or maybe accidents happen. We need to figure out how to help our less fortunate, maybe. We need to figure out how we insure people, because this makes for a better society. And we do this out of maybe altruistic reason, but we also do it because if I were to design a system knowing to the economy, I would want a system like that, because I might be the guy who is going to be in trouble next time. So that's a different type of, so for me, I'm talking about the top. I really do want to understand what are the causes. If it's really skill, then the answer is figure out how to get the best skill possible. For those of you not familiar, in the broad discussion that people are having on this, there's another class of arguments that this is not skill, this is rentier or rent seeking of a different type, right? If that's the cause, then the solution will be very different. But that's the top end. I think the bottom end is, again, to give people a fair, a combination of a fair playing ground, plus our own view of how we want society in terms of transferring and helping those who are less fortunate than us. So I've left out the middle class. The middle class, in some ways, yeah, it does lose out, but that's where, again, the individual effort. I guess I don't have a dystopian view of technology. I believe that people can make use of technology and benefit. It's like peak oil, right? A few years ago, everybody said oil was going to, no more oil, we all be in trouble. But human ingenuity, as long as we allow that ingenuity to flourish, can solve a lot of problems. I guess back to Anne's question, again, if I use this framework, I have two considerations in my mind, right? One consideration is sort of economic. Why outsourcing? What are the benefits? And I think there are good benefits. But then I would want to temper that. So that's the economist in me. Then I would say, okay, from a public policy point of view, what are the incentives I am creating, and how? So what are the incentives I'm creating? And then the next step is also from a justice point of view. So I have to go back to political economy, because we have to decide what kind of society we want. Once we are clear on the causes and the trade-offs, we can have, so a good example of this, roughly speaking, is the US model or the European model. And, we all have our biases, but both societies have decided in a way to have different ways of handling some of these distributional issues. And again, you could argue which is better, which is not, it's a bit preference, but they have decided. So we should decide to some extent.
Thank you. Before I turn the microphone back to Lynn, I'd like to thank the two presenters for their free flow of ideas. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time for questions, but maybe you can buttonhole them during the coffee break or during the lunch. So please join me in thanking them. And
thank you, Dr. Siddiqui, Prof. Kwok, and Dr. Teo. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now conduct our first poll. Please be ready with your polling device. And allow me to briefly explain how to use the device. You may begin voting when you see the question with the list of answers on the screens. To vote, press the numerical digit that corresponds to your choice of answer. If you should change your mind, please key in your new choice of answer within the 30-second polling period. We will now do a test poll. The test poll question is up and it reads, "What is your age?" Please key in the number that corresponds with your choice of answer now. And as you can see, the results are now being shown on the screen, and it looks like the majority of participants today are between the ages of 31 and 60. Okay, we will now move on to the actual poll question. It is now up on the screen, and the question is, which of these differences has Singapore narrowed most since independence? Please key in your choice of answer on the device now. Thank you, everyone. The results are now up on the screen, and we can see that many of you feel that our differences have narrowed in the areas of language and gender. With that, we have come to the end of our first panel discussion.